out of it. But I think really what it does is that it again shows us who are involved in the battle against climate change the importance of sensitizing not just the international community as we've been doing, but also our own domestic residents on the things that need to happen, the things that we have to put in place to ensure that we have proper early warning systems so that if you have flooding, that flooding can be identified at a very early stage so that you could do evacuations if evacuations are possible, that you could have early warning systems for landslides so that if there's a land slippage that you could hurry and get people out of harm's way. So I think those activities are the ones that we have to focus on because everything points to an intensification of extreme weather events in the future with climate change, and everything points to, and when I say extreme weather events, I'm not just talking about flooding, I'm also talking about droughts. So I think this is something that we have to be cognizant of, but it'll be difficult to say that good can come out of it because there's just so much devastation.
Yeah, but what I was referring to is, for example, people having the empirical evidence that we experienced Hurricane Thomas, we experienced the Christmas Eve trough, and now we're experiencing that level of devastation over in Dominica. So therefore, people finally have the evidence to prove that there is something called climate change, and therefore, if we continue to abuse the environment, it will rebel against us. It's like HIV/AIDS. We keep telling people about safe sex and so on. Not until they see somebody who was suffering from HIV or AIDS do they really understand the magnitude of the problem.
Right.
That's what I was talking about.
Agreed. Mm-hmm. And what happened in Dominica this year with the flooding coming on the heels of an extreme drought is similar to what happened to us in 2010, when we had a very debilitating drought, and then we had Hurricane Thomas that year. So there are parallels. Where the parallels end, however, is the fact that with HIV and AIDS, there are things that you can do to protect yourself from it. With climate change, a lot of the impacts of climate change are being caused by transboundary issues. So they're being caused by things that are outside of your control. They're being caused by the large emitting countries like the European Union countries, like the United States, like China, like Russia, that have been emitting greenhouse gases, in particular carbon dioxide, and are now causing this warming of our climate that is resulting in the extreme weather events, resulting in the sea level rise because your polar ice caps are melting. So it almost feels as if there's a little bit of helplessness, you know. So while with HIV/AIDS you could do certain things to protect yourself, there's only so much you could do where climate change is concerned, and you have the adaptation that you must do. There's a limit to it, and I think that's where the difficulty is, and that's why there's a certain feeling of helplessness among small island developing states like ours, that, you know, the international community is bringing this on us and they're not giving us a level of support that we require to be able to deal with the problem.
To the ordinary man in the street who's watching this broadcast right now, and woman as well, and child, what is climate change all about?
Well, climate change is about those, you only hear climate change, but there's a word that precedes this. It's anthropogenic climate change. It's climate change that is caused by man-made activities. There have always been changes to our climate. Our climate has always gone through these cycles of warming and cooling. But what is different this time around is that the changes that we're seeing in our climate are the result of human-induced activity, as a result of man-made activity, as a result of the heavy industrialization that has taken place, that has caused us to be burning fossil fuels, burning gas, burning diesel, burning other fossil fuels at such a high rate that we've emitted so much carbon dioxide into our atmosphere that carbon dioxide, together with other gases like methane, have now caused this kind of greenhouse effect. That's why they refer to as greenhouse gases, which have caused our climate to warm up. So the predictions are that at the current level of emissions of greenhouse gases, we probably will have a warming of our climate, of our planet, by some like 3.5 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. Now that would be catastrophic for countries like ours, low-lying countries like ours. Already, we've seen a warming of our planet by 0.85 degrees. So the warming has already started. Now, what we've said as small island developing states is anything above 1.5 degrees Celsius would be catastrophic for our ecosystems. You will see some massive damage to our environment in small island developing states. You'll see sea level rise because as the climate warms up, your polar ice caps in the North Pole and the South Pole, they start to melt. As they start to melt, the ice turns into water, your sea levels start to rise, and you start seeing things like a 1 meter, 3 feet, or 2 meters, 6-foot sea level rise in our countries, which could have serious effects. As you have more carbon dioxide being emitted into the atmosphere, not only does the planet get warmer because it's a greenhouse gas, but there are two sinks for carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is emitted by burning fossil fuels and other things, but there are two things that absorb carbon dioxide. One is the trees, and if you remember your biology, you know that trees absorb carbon dioxide. But the other part of our environment that absorbs carbon dioxide is our oceans. Our oceans are big sinks for carbon dioxide. But the more carbon dioxide our oceans absorb, is the more acidic they become. You know, and those young people who have done chemistry and who are watching the program now will know carbon dioxide plus water will form something called carbonic acid. And that's what you have developing in our oceans. So as you have more and more carbon dioxide being absorbed, you have more carbonic acid being formed in our oceans. And that has very serious effects on our coral reefs. It'll cause our coral reefs to bleach, to get white, and to eventually die. It'll also cause our shellfish, things like Wigo Wilkes and Lobby. Those shells will not develop the way that they're supposed to develop, and you'll have our shellfish being compromised, and probably you'll see a reduction in catch there for our fishermen. As our ocean temperatures get warmer, some of the fishes that our fishermen are used to, they will no longer see them. So there are very serious impacts. There are health impacts. You'll start seeing diseases that previously you saw in more exotic, more climates that are warmer than ours. You'll start seeing them migrating to the Caribbean, and you know, even older diseases like malaria. One of the problems with malaria, as you know, is spread by the Anopheles mosquito. But the thing that causes malaria, Plasmodium has a shorter life cycle as the temperatures get hotter. So if it would take 28 days for the Plasmodium that is in the Anopheles mosquito, that when it bites you, it transmits it in its saliva to you. If it would take 28 days for this thing to get to maturity, as the temperature gets warmer, it'll only take 21 days. So it is being reproduced more quickly. And also, as you know, in warmer temperatures, mosquitoes bite more frequently. You get more issues with mosquitoes in the warmer months than you get in the cooler months of January, December, January, February. So there's so many impacts of climate change that will spread across all the sectors that it is a monumental issue for us. And that's why we've been trying to get across to the international community the importance of support for islands like ours.
But charity begins at home. And as much as we're just contributing only about 0.3% with regard to the greenhouse gases, as the region I'm talking about, there is need for us to do certain things, but it will take the level of public education on the part of your ministry and other state agencies. With all what you said, it sounds very technical. It could be very bewildering. How do you think will cause the ordinary man in the street to buy in to what is being sold to them?
That's an excellent question, because one of the things that it's not usually a good idea to send technical people to communicate to the man in the street or the woman in the street, as you put it, because they are so caught up in the jargon, in the technical language. So they'll tell you about gigatons of carbon dioxide and meters of sea level rise and greenhouse gas concentrations, parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That means absolutely nothing to the average person. What is relevant to the average person is, how is this going to impact me? And that's why, of late, we've been trying to get that message across by bringing in more messengers, by bringing in more people to help us with disseminating that information. Recently in St. Lucia, we teamed up with a group called PANOS and the Frederick Sifton Institute, also with the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center and the OECS Secretariat, to bring together media personnel like yourself from around the region, and also our artists. So some of our artists from all across the Caribbean, and we have some very prominent artists who have committed to working with us, so that they can, through music, through poetry, through their media articles, can get that message across in a language that the average person understands. But we also have to make people realize that whilst climate change, as we say, is a transboundary issue, it is caused by countries outside of our own boundaries, there are things that we do that worsen the impacts of climate change on us.
Such as?
Such as indiscriminate clearing of forested areas, for example. If you have your mountains, you know, one of the things with your slopes is the more trees you have, the roots bind the soil together. When you chop these trees down, you kill the plant. So that root system, which was holding your soils together, that root system is no longer there. You get a shower of rain, that topsoil is very easily washed out into the ocean. And that has serious impacts. It has impacts where landslides are concerned. It has impacts where flooding is concerned, because also the trees that you've cut, and we've seen that in some of our communities, like in Bexar, for example, where you have a lot of blocking of the watercourses as a result of these micro dams that are formed, because you have these logs blocking up the river, and you have flooding happening much more easily. But the more silt that goes into your water, then the more issues you have with the death of your coral. So those are issues, those are things. People indiscriminately dumping things into the river, pretending as if the river is a garbage disposal system. So you dump refrigerators. We saw it during Hurricane Thomas. I mean, at the Shock Bridge, the number of appliances you saw there. And what happens is that it creates a barrier, and you have this water just coming and hitting against this barrier. Eventually, the bridge will give way. So there are so many things. While climate change is devastating, but there are things that we are doing, I think, that are worsening the impacts of climate change, and we have to see how we can address those issues.
Now, you just attended the second informal ministerial meeting on climate change that was hosted by the incoming president of the 21st Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. What are you all seeking to achieve out of this particular exercise, which is in the lead up to a major conference scheduled for November into December in Paris?
Right. That major conference is the 21st Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. At that 21st Conference of the Parties, a new climate change agreement is expected to be signed by all 196 countries that are party to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change.
That will include the United States and China?
United States, China, Brazil, Russia, India, all the EU countries, all of the Caribbean countries, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, you name it. That will be a new agreement that will govern how we treat with our climate from the year 2020. Now, what the French are very wary of is seeing a repeat of something that happened a few years ago in Copenhagen, when the entire world descended on Copenhagen in Denmark. I think it was for the 15th Conference of the Parties, and they were hoping that there would have been a new climate change agreement coming out of this, and that there would have been momentum at least towards a new climate change agreement. And that did not happen. And there were very famous exchanges between President Chavez at the time, President Obama, and others. In fact, many felt that President Obama hijacked the process the way he came in, and he tried to cause an agreement. So the French are very keen on this not recurring. So what Laurent Fabius, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of France, has done is convene these series of ministerials where he's bringing together ministers from select regions. So, for example, the first ministerial was in July in Paris. I was the only one from the Caribbean invited. This time around, Trinidad was also invited, and their permanent representative to the UN was there, so there's Trinidad and St. Lucia. And you have representatives, the minister from India, from the US, from the United Kingdom, around 45 to 50 countries. What he's trying to do is to establish where there are areas of convergence, where we have agreement on major issues in the agreement, and kind of say, okay, you know what? These areas we've agreed to, so we can give instructions to our negotiators so that they can finalize a text where these issues are concerned. But there are issues where we still have divergence. So, for example, for us, as a small island developing state, the issue of loss and damage, we've said, is our red line. That's our line in the sand. If we're not going to see language that deals with loss and damage, which speaks to the irreversible impacts of climate change, those extreme weather events, flooding, droughts, sea level rise, ocean acidification. If we're not going to see language that speaks to that, then it is very likely that we will not sign that agreement. So he's looking to see how he can get consensus among all of the countries on those divergent areas. So by the time we get to Paris in December, there is a general agreement, and you don't have this last-minute horse trading and anxiety and long nights that normally characterize these conferences of the parties.
What is looking to ensure that you achieve a legally binding and universal agreement on climate change, etc.? Are there any penalties imposed on people who break those agreements?
That's a very good question. There aren't any, and that's one of the issues that is confronting us, because one of the ways in which they're dealing with reduction of greenhouse gases is through something called INDCs, intended nationally determined contributions. And each country is asked to put out its INDC that basically says how it will reduce its emissions of greenhouse gases. But right now, it's a voluntary thing. It's not something that says that if you do not, let's say as China, reduce your greenhouse gas emissions by 30% by the year 2020, or by the year 2025 or 2030, there's a penalty that will attach to it. So it's kind of a gentlemanly agreement that we all come to, and there isn't that level of sanction in there, and that's one of the things that concerns us.
We'll be back in just a moment. You're watching Hot Button Issue right here on Choice Television. Welcome back. Thank you so much for staying with us. You're watching Hot Button Issue right here on Choice Television. And my guest is Dr. James Fletcher. He is the Island's Minister with responsibility for sustainable development, energy, science, and technology. In days of yore, those didn't seem to be relevant portfolios. I don't even think they existed, you know, science, sustainable development, energy, science and technology, and all that. But it's quite apt now to have those portfolios and to have somebody really who's manning those respective areas. How Herculean a task you think it is to be the minister responsible for those portfolios?
Well, it's challenging. It's exciting. It's, I think, one of the good things that Prime Minister Anthony did when he put together that portfolio is that he took the various elements of the environment that resided in different portfolios, in different ministries, and put them together. So, for example, water which is a very important element of my portfolio, water resided within the Ministry of, what was then the Ministry of Communications, Works, Transport, and Public Utilities. But there was an element of water, the Water Resources Management Agency, that resided within the Ministry of Agriculture. Then you had the environment. The environment resided within the Ministry of Physical Development, Environment, and Housing. And forestry, which, because we don't have a forestry sector that is based on the exploitation and the mining of forest resources for timber like Guyana does. So forestry for us is more about natural resource management, and forestry was always part of the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fisheries. So forestry was brought in, and then science and technology, being a new field, was put in, and then sustainable development basically captures climate change, biodiversity, all of these other issues. So the challenge for us really was bringing in those agencies that previously resided in other agencies, other ministries, and creating one seamless, cohesive ministry that where the elements spoke to each other. And they're very exciting portfolios, particularly now with everything going on with climate change and biodiversity and water and energy. So I wouldn't say it's any more challenging than running a Ministry of Infrastructure or Ministry of Commerce, right. But because it's a new ministry and because it has such a heavy science base, then it presents its own challenges.
So it doesn't appear mundane an issue when you attend, for example, the COP21 in Paris between November and December.
There's nothing mundane about these COPs. In fact, I marvel at how well small island developing states are able to represent themselves in COPs, for the simple reason that we're always under-resourced. Because we go to a COP, St. Lucia, for example, will go to a COP with a minister and maybe 2 or 3 technical officers, because that's the extent of what is being paid for by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat. So St. Lucia will be there with 3 people, with their minister, Antigua, Barbados, all of the islands, maximum of 2 or 3 people. But the United States will go there with a delegation that is probably 30 strong. And they have their lawyers, they have their scientists, they have all the technical experts on adaptation, on emissions, on means of implementation like finance and capacity building. They have experts in all of these areas. Now, when you go to a COP, the COP is 2 weeks long. And you have all these negotiating sessions taking place simultaneously. Now, it's very easy if you're the United States or you're the EU or you're Brazil or you're Mexico or you're China, for you to have your people dedicated to those various areas, and they deal with the respective areas, and then they caucus at some point in their delegation headquarters, and they agree on strategy. If you're St. Lucia, then you have 2 people covering everything. So you have, in the case of St. Lucia, you'll have Don Pianathoniel, who is our expert on adaptation and loss and damage. So you'll have Don covering the adaptation, loss and damage issues. You'll have Crispin Dovey covering finance and covering maybe the mitigation issues. And that's the way it happens with every single island. And
so you have the mercy of those developed countries.
Basically, you are. And what very often happens to Tim is that the negotiations don't start at 8 in the morning and end at 6 in the evening. Negotiations go on. So in Warsaw, for example, the Warsaw COP, that was COP 19, was supposed to end on Friday at 5:30. At midnight on that Friday, I was in meetings with AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States, which is one of the negotiating blocs that St. Lucia negotiates under. We were having meetings with the EU and with the US we had a meeting with the EU at midnight. We had a meeting with the US at 1 o'clock in the morning. At 3 o'clock, 3:30 in the morning, I said to my negotiating team, guys, I'm going to go back to my hotel, get a couple of hours sleep, take a shower, and come back to meet you guys at 8 o'clock in the morning, which I did. Went back to the hotel at 4 o'clock in the morning, came back at 8 o'clock. My technical officers never left, because they were there waiting to hear what was coming out of the various discussions. And you would hear that the plenary would reconvene at 5 o'clock in the morning to get an update on what is going on. So when I got back to the Warsaw headquarters for COP, people like Dawn had never left. She had just maybe grabbed a couple of minutes sleep on a beanbag somewhere in a corner. That COP did not end until maybe 7 o'clock that Saturday. So there were people from our small island states who had gotten to the COP venue at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock on Friday morning and had not gotten back to their hotel before 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock on Saturday night. I mean, and that's the level of dedication you have from the small island delegations that are there. On the side of the US, for example, they can do a relay. So somebody will leave, somebody else will come, and they don't bat an eyelid. Now, yeah, it's a little challenging for them, but certainly nowhere near as challenging as it is for us. And we're covering multiple negotiations at the same time. So it really is a challenging task. And these COPs, and there's the one word you will never use to describe a COP is mundane or boring. COPs are probably sometimes a little too exciting, and there are people who live there just on caffeine.
So come the next COP, COP 21. You think that we'll be entering that particular engagement from an advantageous position, considering what happened to Dominica in August? And if Prime Minister Roosevelt Skerrit attends?
I don't think we will, for the simple reason that COP19 in Warsaw, in Poland, Typhoon Haiyan had just gone through the Philippines. And the delegate from the Philippines, the lead negotiator from the Philippines, actually went on a hunger strike at the beginning of COP19. That did not sway anyone, unfortunately. In fact, I distinctly remember that same Saturday I was talking about, where we had a huddle on loss and damage because we were not making any progress on loss and damage. I'd been to the Europeans, trying to get them to see things our way, been to Todd Stern, the lead negotiator, the climate change envoy for the US, to try to get him to come around to our side and see things, and they were not budging. On our side, the African group, the LDC group, least developed countries, and us, AOSIS, we were not budging either because we wanted to see loss and damage in the text of that document. And we negotiate also on the G77 plus China, which is a group of 77 plus China, which is actually the group of 134 because G77 plus China is actually 134 countries. But in there you have countries like Saudi Arabia, you have Iran, you have Iraq, you have China, you have India, you have the United Arab Emirates, you have Qatar. So you have countries and you have all of the AOSIS countries. So you have St. Lucia, you have Tuvalu, you have Marshall Islands, you have Seychelles, you have Singapore, you have Haiti. You have countries that are, you have Bangladesh, you have countries that are very impoverished, you have countries that are oil importers, but you also have countries that are oil producers. You have countries that are major emitters, like China, and it's very difficult to arrive at a consensus. So, you know, the challenge always is to try to find a way of arriving at consensus. But going back to that COP, when the delegate from the Philippines went on a hunger strike, that didn't sway anyone. People, as far as they're concerned, I think people they accept that these extreme weather events will happen. Hurricane Sandy did not cause the Americans to change the trajectory of their negotiations. And Hurricane Sandy hit the northeast seaboard of the United States, devastated them. That didn't cause them to come in and say, okay, boy, you know what? We finally understand what you small island countries that are in the path of hurricanes have been saying all along. We're sympathetic to you. We've had Sandy. We've had Katrina. We want to negotiate maybe to be a little bit more sympathetic. That does not change.
Why do you think those countries are not yielding?
I think for very many different reasons. I think, first of all, there is a fear of financial compensation. This is one of the things that, for example, in our loss and damage negotiations, the Americans have said the same way loss and damage for us is a red line, liability and financial compensation for them is another red line. So they do not want anything in an agreement that suggests that if Tropical Storm Erica hits Dominica, or Hurricane Tomas, or some other hurricane hits St. Lucia, that we can say that is attributable to climate change, and you now have to go into your pockets and make automatic payments to us as a result of this. They reject that argument completely. So I think that's part of the difficulty for them. There is also in the United States of America an issue of the politics of climate change, because whilst President Obama has done a very good job, I believe, of elevating climate change to a discussion within his government and to really show some leadership. Last year, he went across to China. He met with President Xi Jinping and got an agreement that they would work towards an ambitious climate change agreement in Paris. He went across to India and he met with Prime Minister Modi and also agreed that there would be some cooperation towards an aggressive climate change agreement in Paris. The Republican Congress is dead set against any legally binding climate change agreement. There are people in there like Inhofe, one of the Republicans, who, as far as he's concerned, God created the planet, God created man. It is arrogant of man to believe that he can affect the climate. The only person who could affect the climate is God. So there is no such thing as man-made climate change, and he rejects it completely. So in some instances, it's the domestic politics. In some instances, it is the fear of the level of compensation that would be required. And you have people, I believe, who go to negotiations under this very strict instructions to make sure that the status quo remains. And that's what makes it difficult for us, because we keep telling them that while for some of them climate change is an academic discussion, whether it's 2 degrees or 2.5 or 3 or how many gigatons of carbon dioxide, for us it's existential. It's life and death. There are people who are dying. People died in Dominica. There are people who are losing their livelihoods. There are fishermen who are seeing their catches decrease. There are tourism products that are being destroyed because of coral reefs being damaged. There are coastlines that are disappearing because of sea level rise. There are groundwater sources that are now becoming salty because of sea level rise. All of these things are happening because of climate change. So for us, we're in a life and death negotiation. So it's not a discussion about how many dollars or what your Congress can do. This is life and death for us.
So they will not even listen to the Pope, because just a few months ago, he issued this 184-page papal encyclical. And the Pope said, and he called for a radical transformation of politics, economics, and individual lifestyles to confront environmental degradation and climate change, blending a biting critique of consumerism and irresponsible development with a plea for swift and unified global action. He's also saying that the brunt of the effects of climate change are being felt by the poor. And it is being caused, of course, by rich nations. Yeah. So they will not even listen to the Pope.
And I was very proud of Pope Francis for what he wrote. That encyclical, I think, was very much on point. It was very comprehensive. But guess what? The Republicans, even the Republicans who are staunch Catholics in the United States, said, we respect our Pope, we like our Pope, but he's wrong. Where climate change is concerned, he's wrong. He might be right on religious issues, on spiritual issues, but on climate change, he's wrong. And he should probably leave those discussions for other people who are much more skilled to do it. So no, they don't accept what the Pope is saying. They don't accept what the science is saying. The science is very clear. The science is clear what are the impacts of climate change. The science is clear that on the current levels of greenhouse gas emissions that we have, that we will have a 4 degrees Celsius warming of our planet. The science is clear that even with the pledges that some of the countries have made on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we will not get down to below 2 degrees Celsius. We're probably more on track for 3.5 degrees Celsius. The science is clear that anything above 1.5 degrees Celsius is going to cause irreparable damage to small island states and low-lying states like those in the Caribbean and those in the Pacific and those in the Indian and Mediterranean Ocean. All of that science is very, very clear. You have the Lancet, one of the most respected medical journals, teaming up with the University College London and showing that climate change will cause serious issues where public health is concerned, and probably roll back a lot of the advances that have been made in public health globally over the last decade or two, that climate change will do that. But people are just, you have people like Lord Stern, who put out this book called The Economics of Climate Change that showed very clearly the impacts of climate change. They reject the science. Those people who are climate skeptics, for one reason or the other, just refuse to accept it. And it's difficult to get the two sides to meet. However, I think there are signs that within some of the countries that were resistant to issues like loss and damage, for example, you're seeing movement where the Americans are concerned. You're seeing movement where the European Union is concerned. And the challenge that we had in Warsaw during COP19 to get loss and damage as part of the agreement, I'm seeing a softening of that. So in Paris, just 2 days ago, when I chaired the session on adaptation and loss and damage, I was very pleased to see the responses of people like the EU and the Americans and even Australia, who have been resistant to loss and damage being seen as something separate from adaptation. And loss and damage refers to those things to which you cannot adapt. So we say if you have sea level rise that has taken away parts of your coastline, you can't adapt to that. If you have your corals disappearing as a result, your corals dying as a result of your oceans becoming more acidic or your seas getting warmer, you can't adapt to that. What are you going to do? If your oceans are acidic, you can't go and dump endless bicarbonate of soda into the oceans to change the acidity of the ocean. If you have extreme weather events that, in the case of Dominica, wipes out communities like Petit Savan, what are you going to do? How do you adapt to that? If you have droughts that have caused you to now have climate refugees because certain parts of your country are no longer inhabitable, or your fishermen can no longer get access to their fish catch. So that is that is irreversible loss and damage. And we need to see this treated differently to adaptation, to something where you could adapt to it and you could make some changes and you could make adjustments around it. It's only now that we're seeing some of these countries saying, okay, we accept that there is such a thing called loss and damage, but even there we have reservations about how do you attribute loss and damage. So you can't tell me that I'm responsible for it because I'm the one who has been emitting, so I have to pay out for it. So, those are issues that really come into the conversation.
You use a phrase, a term there, that's climate refugees. The first time I'm hearing about this. What is this all about? And can we reach a stage where we can be impacted to that extent?
Absolutely. In fact, one of the discussions that we've been having in the whole loss and damage discussion is to see how we can put in place a system to deal with what we've called a climate displacement facility. Those people who are being displaced as a result of climate change. People whose homes, whose environment, whose towns, whose communities have now been rendered uninhabitable, unlivable because of climate change. What are you going to do with these people? What are you going to do with a country like the Maldives? The highest point on the Maldives is 2 meters high. That's 6 feet. When you have sea level rise, if you have sea level rise of 1 meter or 2 meters, it means the entire Maldives will disappear. Where are these people going to live? So yes, you will have something called climate refugees, and how do you treat with them is something that we're looking at under this climate displacement facility. How do you treat with things like insurance? You have a Caribbean catastrophe risk insurance facility, which is a very good facility, and which some of the other countries are looking to see how they can put in place. So how do you put that in place so that you can deal with some of these risks that are associated with climate change? Early warning systems is another thing that we have to see how we can put in place, as we've been doing with canneries, with some consultations with ancillary, with Marsha. And these are all things that we're trying to engage the international community and saying to them, you need to give us help in our countries to put these things in place to minimize loss of lives and also to minimize on the loss of livelihoods that our people will encounter.
You're watching Hot But Nation. We come back in just a moment. We'll be taking your calls for my guest, the Islands Minister with responsibility for sustainable development, technology, also science, is Dr. James Fletcher. Stay with us. Welcome back. We'll put the telephone number on screen right now so that you can call with your questions and comments for my guest. Once again, he is the Island's Minister with responsibility for sustainable development, energy, science, and technology, Dr. James Fletcher. Any particular concerns about the folks on the island's east coast as well as those who are on the west coast, in low-lying areas, the likes of Ancillary, Dennery, and so on?
Definitely. If we can start with probably the West Coast.
Apologies, hold that point.
You have a call?
You have a call. Good evening. Hot button issue, you on the air?
Good night.
Hi, good night.
I'm
Good evening,
calling
caller.
for my father right now. He has a couple concern saying that, like, concerning the desilting, like silt is being poured into the Ancillary River, and it is done by C.O. Williams, and this is affecting the coral reefs and such.
Okay. What say you, Doc?
It's a good question. We've been trying to communicate and work more closely with the Ministry of Infrastructure. I know the people at the Forestry Department and also the Water Resources Management Agency have had some issues about the way in which desilting has taken place in the past, not just the way in which the silt is disposed of, but even in some instances when the desilting takes place, trees that have been planted along the riverbank to stabilize those soils, the operators of the equipment are not aware of that, and they just pass and they just take all these trees away, and they undo a lot of the hard work of the Forestry Department. So we've been trying to work more closely with them to ensure that in trying to solve one problem, you don't create another problem. So it's a very good point.
Yeah, another caller 9. Good evening. Go ahead with your contribution, caller.
Yes, good night.
Good evening to you,
Good
sir.
night.
Yes, and to you and your guests. It's always a pleasure hearing from you, Mr. Dr. James.
Thank you.
Yes, can you enlighten us with the backlog of CMOS, the seaweeds that, cause the power bridges? Because I heard a story that it has a lot to do with the disappearance of the black sea urchins. Can you enlighten us a little more on that, please, if you know of it?
You mean the Sargassum seaweed?
Yeah.
Yes, okay.
Thanks a lot, sir.
The Sargassum seaweed, it really is a big problem affecting the entire Caribbean. In fact, I read that the Vice Chancellor of the university said he believes it's the biggest problem affecting the Caribbean right now. There are some schools of thought that believe that the Sargassum seaweed is also one of those offshoots of climate change because of the warmer temperatures and also the changing currents, how that is affecting the movement of the Sargassum seaweed. To be honest, I can't tell you that I have a direct answer to that question and whether there are any correlations. All I know is that it really is a serious problem that has to be addressed because it is causing some serious impacts on our environment, on our fishery, on basically the quality of life of the people who live in those areas, and also on our tourism infrastructure.
Another caller 9. Good evening.
Hello, good evening.
Good evening to you, sir. Good evening to you.
And Dr. Fletcher.
Good evening.
First of all, I must congratulate Timothy for a very good topic, choosing a very good topic, out from the ordinary politics, etc. Very good, Timothy. I just want to indicate that I'm very pleased that Dr. Kenny Anthony finally listened to me in the formation of a science and technology portfolio. Dr. Fletcher would know what I'm talking about.
Yes, I do.
At least they say Dr. Kenny Anthony doesn't listen, but he does in fact listen to people. The formation of that particular ministry has evolved from what was known as the Science Committee, which was in Dr. Anthony's portfolio, but which he often gave me to do. And there was a very good lady there called Dr. Ephraim, I think it was, who was very, very good in terms of formulating the future for the science and technology portfolio, and I want to congratulate her. I haven't seen her for a very long time.
She's now with the OECS.
Okay, thank you. I also want to say that I'm very proud of Dr. Fletcher. He was a very good choice by Dr. Anthony, and I want to congratulate you for the work that you have done, not only for St. Lucia, but regionally and internationally on this particular topic.
Thank you.
However, I just want to point out that the success of what you're doing, I think, is dependent on the education of the ordinary man. St. Lucia has never had a history or of science-oriented people. And a lot of the work that you're doing requires education for people to understand some of the issues. So you need a science-conscious population, and of course that starts with the schools. Now, you talked about the question of early warning systems. Again, the education of people comes in there. I remember I go to my farm nearly every morning, and there was an instrument that was placed by the Dayglow Bridge for the monitoring of the flow of the water, the streams, the river, which was important to give you empirical data, which Timothy was asking you about earlier, to develop early warning systems. And what happened?
It was vandalized.
Some vandal came and took the batteries and all this kind of thing, and the thing just went dead. So a lot of those things, we ourselves have to be conscious of the need for the protection of this type of equipment and the value that it's going to have for us in saving lives, etc. Hence the reason why I talk about the education of the ordinary folk. The other one that I wanted to bring to your attention was the abnormal weather conditions. And this has been going on for some time. Now, what has happened is that there has been a change in the weather pattern, because normally the St. Lucia weather, there was always what is known, you might have heard your mother talk about a PTKWM,
Yes, yes.
which was a small dry season in the wet season, which lasted for about 6 weeks. But within recent years, this has changed completely, so that you have what I term a GOKWM in the rainy season. So you have the rainy season being virtually dry. Now, right now, I have that experience where my soil conditions are not good enough for the planting of, let us say, pumpkins. And we are in the wet season. Therein lies the question of getting the students involved. Some of the students could do projects on the soil moisture conditions as they change in time and so on. And another very good one would be the question of determination of the silt loads in the major rivers like Trumasse and so on. A lot of projects that could be this thing. I don't want to take all the time, but one other point, since water is on your portfolio, and that relates to Wasco. And I just want to give this as an example of the use of S&T and what you're doing in relation to the economic impact of it, as well as how it's going to affect the ordinary citizen. A 10%, 10-point-something% was put on the tariff of the 66% for Wasco for desilting of the dam. And it is now being said that that might be removed, okay, because it was temporary. However, because of the climate change that is occurring, the implication is that the frequency that will be required for the desilting would increase, so that you have to change your strategy to perhaps have as a permanent feature the silting of the dam every 5 years, a serious silting, but an intermittent one during the year so that you do not wait for the accumulation over a long period of time, because as has happened, you only have 2/3 of the volume available for your water.
It's actually 1/2 now.
So that the implication for the ordinary man, and he must know that, is that it is likely that the government of Wasco has no alternative but to maintain that 10% on the tariff increase in Wasco.
Okay, sir.
I can go on and on and on, but
But
I just wanted to bring this thing. Thank you very much.
appreciate the contribution, sir. But just to follow up on what Mr. Calix George, former Communications and Works Minister, was saying, do you think it's need now to leave this dredging fee there, to have it as a permanent fixture?
Well, let's put it this way. The amount of money collected by the dredging fee will not deal with the requirement for dredging the dam. The dam has a capacity of 3 million cubic meters. Right now, 1.5 million cubic meters of that is silt. So half of the dam is silt. Now, as Mr. Calix George has said, it has severely reduced the capacity of the dam. We've estimated that to restore the dam to its original capacity will be a long-term process, because we cannot just move in and excavate all of the silt from the dam. Just the mere trucking of that silt from one point to another might end up costing more than the actual desilting. So we actually looking at a system that will be a continuous year-long process of desilting the dam, not year-long, sorry, but every year process, annual process of desilting the dam. So he's absolutely right. I don't see this desilting being something that is done as a one-shot over 2 years and 3 years and we get it over and done with. I think the Wasco guys have estimated that it probably will take us around 10 years to bring that dam back to its former capacity. And then you also have the problem of having to reforest some of the adjacent areas, because if you do not do that, when it rains, you will have the classic Creole phrase that I like to use in the Senate of laver la main sur la terre, because all of that silt will just come straight back in. The point he made about the changing weather patterns is absolutely correct. And again, that's where the science comes in. It shows you that since 1880, some of the hottest years we've had have all happened since 1998. 2014 was the hottest year we've ever had since we started recording data, and that was hotter than 2010, which was the previous hottest year. July 2015 of this year was the hottest July on record, and 2015 looks like it will blow 2014 out of the window. And what is making matters even worse is that you have this El Nino phenomenon, which is causing this PT Kawem, as Mr. George said, to extend into a Go Kawem, and the Met Office has said that we probably will go until the end of September with these abnormally dry conditions. So there's a multitude of factors working here which have really caused our weather system to change completely.
Let's squeezing a final call. Good evening. Quick comment or question, caller?
Hi, good evening, Tim. Good evening, Mr. Fletcher.
Good evening.
Mr. Fletcher, the government to which you are part is guilty of doing a lot of things like building bridges strong, repairing the roads, and doing it very well. And a couple other things that your party and the government that they're from is doing very well in the country. At what point through your ministry are we going to see a levy or something like a burden be placed on the producers of plastic bottles and those firms that actually produce things that block our waterways? Because I know this Indonesian Labour Party, although they're not popular for doing the right things, in doing things right, but I would like to know that collectively, cabinet and everybody comes together and say that all those factories that do contribute to the waste that clogs our waterways, that a certain program like a collection of bottles through their department that they pay, they create jobs because we want to create more jobs. So they have a bundle of guys, that are charged with the responsibility of collecting their bottles for them. And what they do with it is something that we can also, make sure that they have a recycle process. But I want to know that this government, that I support, and proudly so, implement something like that will create employment and at the same time keep our waterways clean. What do you say about it? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Well, caller, my response might make people think that you were set up by me, and I have no idea who just called to ask that question. In fact, I had a chat with the Prime Minister let me go back. The Prime Minister, I think, in his budget statement 2 years ago, actually promised this refundable containers bill that the college has asked for. Now, something good happened at the St. Lucia Solid Waste Management Authority 2 weeks ago that we kept very quiet because I was a little embarrassed about it. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it because it really ought to have happened some time ago. And that's the commissioning of the tire shredder. So the tire shredder is now working, so we can now start on reducing those huge mounds of tires, both at Dayglow and at Viewfort. But I said to the Prime Minister that, Prime Minister, now that we've commissioned the tire shredder, the next thing we must have in place is this refundable containers bill to do precisely what the college has asked about, to put a value on those plastics so that those plastics can now not be seen as something to just be discarded in waterways and in sidewalks and in drains, but now have a value and can be returned to the people and maybe to a depot. Now, it's also important because we're working together with Sir Richard Branson's Carbon War Room and the Rocky Mountain Institute to put in place what we hope will be a waste-to-energy facility at Dayglow that will allow for the conversion of a lot of these plastics into energy, because we have two landfills, one in Dayglow and one in Viewfort, that have a finite lifespan. Dayglow, if we continue collecting garbage at Dayglow at its current rate, probably within the next 5 years, we'll have to decommission Dayglow. Viewfort, a little shorter than that. There aren't many places in St. Lucia that are begging and saying, convert me into landfills. So we have to do a much better job, maybe go into a zero landfill state where we use up as much of our waste as possible. And to do that, we have to go the route of waste to energy. So caller, I agree with you 100%. Prime Minister has asked me to write to the Attorney General to ask that refundable containers bill be finalized. There's not much work that has to be done with it. So I'm hoping that sometime before the end of this year, we can see this refundable containers bill go into Parliament and that it will do precisely what you just asked for.
Thank you so much, sir, for being my guest on this evening's Hot
Thank
Button
you, Tim. My pleasure. I must commend you for doing this. I think it was an excellent initiative.
Thank you so much. Just heard there from the island's Minister with responsibility for sustainable development, energy, science, and technology, Dr. James Fletcher. If it's Wednesday, we discuss a hot button issue right here on Choice Television. Time now for the clip that peaked. Some of the scenes of general elections over in Port of Spain, Trinidad, where the PNM won that poll during the general election on Monday of this week, capturing 23 of the island's or the country's 41 seats. And the PP, that's the People's Partnership Party, getting the other 18. That's the broadcast. Once again, here is a very good evening. My name is Timothy Polion. See you next time.